Okay, today we're going to talk about grading comics, about CGC, the Certified Guarantee Company, and just go over a lot of things that the general public is not aware about. We're going to talk about, first of all, let's talk about comic book grading. Most people think all of their comic books are mint. They're not mint. First of all, comic books are not minted. They're printed. Coins are minted, comic books are printed. Even if you were to go to the newsstand and pick out the very best copy every single day that new comics were released, you're not going to end up with the top end pieces ever. You're not going to end up with all what CGC would say would be 9/8 copies. You're going to end up with a mishmash of stuff that could grade as low as maybe 8. A lot of people tend to think that a comic book, just because it's old and has survived for a long time, is in an optimum condition. But CGC and comic fans do not take into account the age when grading a comic. The grade of a comic is based on the criteria of how many marks it has, how many dents it has, how many rips it has, how much it's been handled, whether the spine is rolled, what color are the pages, whether it's accumulated some dirt or other defects, and on and on and on. It's an accumulation of everything that's on that comic book. The survival factor does not necessarily ever factor into what the grade is. The grade of a comic book from 1938 is the same way you would grade a comic book that was manufactured just yesterday. Okay, there are a lot of comic books that there's a third-party grading system that's called the Certified Guarantee Company. This arose from coin grading. People who had already established a coin grading company where they encapsulate the coin and give it a grade. Thus, you cannot, once you open the coin, you can no longer have that definite third-party grading assurance any longer. They decided to extend themselves into comic books. Coin grading company NGC formed a comic grading company under their umbrella, and that was CGC. CGC stands for, as I said before, the Certified Guaranteed Company. They are a third-party grading company. They began about in the year 2000. One of the reasons why they started doing it was because of what was happening on eBay. On eBay, there were a lot of people selling comics, getting good prices for them, but most of the people, unless they had been in the comic book business for some time, had absolutely no concept of how to grade a book. Okay. When CGC arrived, now people could send in their comics to CGC. CGC would grade them objectively, encapsulate them. Then people buying books off of sellers on eBay could be basically assured that the comic book was close to the grade that they hoped it would be. This did away with a lot of the bad dealers, but they still abound. It didn't totally reduce the problem, because there are a lot of people who don't even want to buy CGC books because they are comic fans and they don't even like the idea of encapsulating comic books. Okay, not all comics should be encapsulated. First of all, most all comics from 1980 and onward are very, very abundant. If you have mostly comic books that you've collected from the last 30 years or more, unless you want to hold on to them another 30, 50 years, you're not going to get much for them when you take them to the comic shop. You're going to be it's going to be a very sad thing to discover that the books that you thought, which you meticulously went through the Overstreet price guide and priced at $3, $4, $5, are only going to yield you maybe 10 cents a piece. Those low value figures in the price guide of anything basically $10 and under, those are token, kind of obligatory prices that are set on comics that are not in reality necessarily realistic when it comes time to sell or even buy the books. Most of those books are things that we would call dollar box fodder. And so there's a lot of comics that are not worth CGCing. When you CGC a book, okay, it's going to cost you a fair amount of money. The lowest tier on CGC is basically the modern tier for 1980 books and above, which is going to cost you a minimum of $18 just to have that encapsulated. On top of that, you're going to pay a $5 invoice charge, and on top of that, you're going to have to pay for the postage to send it to CGC in Sarasota, which is going to be fairly costly, and you're going to pay a hefty fee for CGC to send them back to you once they've been encapsulated, and they're quite heavy, and they're going to send it registered mail. So what started out being only an $18 cost ultimately might cost you as much as $30 just to have a single comic encapsulated. And that's just the beginning tier. As the other value tiers go up, you're going to be paying $25 for comics that have a value up to $150. For comics that have a value up to $300, you have to pay $35, and it continues on up from there. The ultimate and the most you can pay to have a comic encapsulated is on a walkthrough charge. If you take the comic in, you're going to pay 3% of what is considered the fair market value, up to a maximum of $3,000. So if you have a comic that could be valued at $100,000, you'll pay $3,000. If you had a $200,000 comic book, you're still going to pay $3,000 because that's the limit. But just to encapsulate a single rare valuable comic book, you're going to pay up to $3,000 plus postage fees and other assorted things as well. So you have to be careful in grading and choosing the comic books you want to have graded, because you need to be able to CGC them and to be able to add the price of CGCing them to the cost of it when you sell it. And if you don't, you're not going to be making much money on having the book CGC'd. This book here reveals itself to be a nice condition book, and it's what is it? It's from 1965, so 35, 45. It's a 48-year-old book, and it's only a 7.5, which is a better copy, but the book only values in the Overstreet for about $50. The person who CGC'd it didn't know quite how to grade books, or assumed that this was a super nice looking book. You know, me looking at it, you know, I can find, you know, little hairs here on the spine, a little roughness here, and all of these things add up to degrading the book from a potential 9.8, which is generally the highest you will get from CGC, down to a 7.5. Being that this book only grades guide-wise, price-wise, for $50, if you're going to add a $30 cost onto this book, you're not going to get $80 out of it nowadays for this book, so you're not going to get the $50 that you might have gotten for a raw sale potentially, plus $30 to work it, you know, to CGC it. So it's not worth it. You know, people need to realize that not all comic books have great value, and they need to realize how to grade comics. If they don't know how to grade comics and they want to have something CGC'd, they need to go to a CGC authorized dealer and have him look at the comics and help him, you know, assess for you whether or not this should be done, and then he can send them into CGC for you. And hopefully he'll be an honest person who won't just take your money and run, and he will advise you that certain things are not worth doing and certain other things are. Take, for instance, something like this, which is a Kellogg's giveaway, Superman giveaway from 1955. One of the tools that a CGC dealer has at his disposal is an internet website for CGC, where you can go on, and that is an authorized dealer can go on, put in his dealer number, and he can look up a census, which tells you how many copies there are of a CGC'd book. In the instance of this Superman Duel in Space giveaway, there's one copy that's 9.8, and then below that there are 3 copies that are listed in 9.4, and there's a total of 13 copies of this that have been CGC'd. That's not to say there's only 13 existing copies in the world, because there's plenty of copies that have not been CGC'd. But the best found CGC copy so far is a 9.8, which you're not going to ever, or seldom ever, find books that are above 9.8. 9.9s are very, very rare. 10s are basically hen's teeth, okay? So this is in actuality the second best graded book, because it's one of the 3 in 9.4. Being that it's such a high number in the census, this is a book that would be worth CGC because you might get some extra value out of it versus selling it raw. And being that it's an older book from 55 and something that is quite rare, it is something that should be CGC'd and worth CGC.